You've spoken a lot about the influence, I suppose, of Christianity on the Germanic peoples, but I also know, and it's something that I read about recently through, I think it was Oswald Spengler who's talking about through the rise of the West, as it were, which is based upon Christianity when it became the foundation of that civilization, and the decline of it was having lost sight of that. He said in that we often think that Europe and Northern Europe was Christianized, but actually Christianity was Germanized. And I think you've done some films that make that exact point, which is, and perhaps you can unpack it for us. How did the peoples of the northwestern Europe, very different from those in I suppose the Middle East, end up taking on the Hebrew God, as it were?
There's a popular narrative, of the Germanization of Christianity, which was based on a book that came out in 1990 by J.C. Rowsell. And I have no doubt that there are survivals of Germanic culture in the Germanic countries after they became Christian. I mean, it's absolutely certain, because you see in the law code specifically that that the laws in early Christian Sweden, in early Christian Germany, even among the Lombards in Italy and in England, Anglo-Saxon England, they still contained things that were trying to cope with the pre-existing culture of the Germanic peoples, which didn't just go away when they became Christian. They remained Germanic peoples with, like, for example, duties of revenge. And they didn't just say, now you're Christian, you're not allowed to take revenge on people. Instead, they had complicated ways of dealing with revenge and trying to discourage people from killing each other in revenge, for which is what Germanic people are supposed to do. But that, I think the book goes too far when it claims that Christianity itself in Europe has been changed somehow by Germanic people. I don't think that's true. And some of the things that, like, some people say, like, oh, it became a militant religion. Well, actually, it was already a militant religion, because first off, the Jews in the Old Testament are extremely violent. Secondly, it was the religion of the Roman Empire. And the Romans weren't exactly pacifists. They were extremely brutal people. So it was already, by the time it reached the Germanic people, it was already militarized. I mean, Constantine said, make of me, he saw that, use me as a weapon, or use me as a sword. He saw the cross in the sky, or this vision of Christianity for Rome, the Roman Empire. So if it hadn't have been militarized, it wouldn't have even reached the Germanic people probably in the first place. So I think they exaggerate that. But how did it spread across Northwest Europe is your question. Well, actually, the Romans brought it to Britain first. And there's a sort of like narrative which overlooks the nuances of the reality, where it says Romans brought it to Northwest Europe and it's been there ever since. Kind of, but actually not really, because after the Romans left, there wasn't a great deal of, I don't think Christianity was doing great in Britain. There were still some pockets of Celtic paganism, even at the time the Romans left. But Wales, the parts of Britain that really stayed very Christian, are the parts where the Romans didn't go. So, or the British Isles rather. So Wales, which was not particularly Roman, didn't have a large Roman presence, was very important for the survival of Christianity in Northwest Europe, because Wales sent a mission to Ireland. St. Patrick was there. And then Ireland became vital for the survival of Christianity in Britain, because they set up the Columban monastery on Iona, from which missions were sent to the Picts to convert the Picts to Christianity, because the Romans never brought Christianity to the Picts. They sent a mission to Northumbria to make the Angles there Christian, and that was successful. And they sent also missions to their brother Gaels who had inhabited Scotland, because after the fall of Rome, Irish invaders called the Scotti invaded Scotland and settled. And those Scotti were not Christians. They were pagan Gaels living in Scotland. And but the Christian Gaels converted them. So it's 3 different races of Britain there converted by that mission. And at the same time, the Welsh were sending missions into southwest Britain, into Devon and Cornwall, where there had been survivals of Celtic paganism. And at this same time, Germanic pagans, the English, were coming in from the east and conquering all of England and bringing paganism back to Britain, a new type of paganism, Germanic paganism. But those Germanic Saxons were converted also from a mission from Rome. There was the Gregorian mission, as well as the Celtic missions from the north. So as a consequence, the Anglo-Saxons became one of the first properly Christianized Germanic peoples, although there had been, of course, long before the Anglo-Saxons, the Goths had been Christian, but they were Arian Christians, the Arian heresy, where they didn't believe in the divinity of Christ. And the Goths as people just disappeared from history because they all sort of blended in with all the different places they invaded in Iberia, Ukraine, wherever they went. But the Anglo-Saxons remained a Germanic people, and they kept their contacts with the Germanic world. And therefore, people like St. Boniface, who's from here in Devon, he felt it was his duty to go and convert preach to the Saxons on the continent, because they were his, racial brothers. They were Germanic people, and he wanted to bring the word of Christ to them to save them. So these kinds of missions that the Anglo-Saxons sent into the continent were very important, because, Saint Weilbert, also from Devon, she's now like the saint of a patron saint in Germany and Sweden. Boniface, of course, Willibrord, many Anglo-Saxon saints or preachers were going into Germany, Sweden, even Finland. Henry of Uppsala, he's called, who was in eastern Sweden. He was actually an Englishman who was sent from Sweden into Finland to go and preach even further. So there's knock-on effect. Once the Celtic people had succeeded in converting a Germanic people, the Anglo-Saxons then went on to convert many other Germanic peoples. So it was not, you can't just say the Romans did it, because they really didn't. It could have gone a very different way than it did. It was the victory of Christianity in Northern Europe was not assured at all. And many people rejected it. And many Anglo-Saxon kings who converted then went back to being pagan because they thought it was better. Sweden wasn't even converted properly until like the 1200s or 1100s. So it's much, its power in the north was tenuous at times. And these Celtic monks living like St. Anthony on these as hermits on little islands here and there, somehow managed to change the course of history.
It is fascinating just how humble their beginnings were when you consider the impact they have. I mean, I've been to Iona and seen this one-person cell dug out at the top of this windy hill, and to think that there was quite a militaristic island kingdom there, which effectively incubated the likes of Aidan, who went on to found Lindisfarne, Holy Island, Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumberland, which then became a beacon within early Christendom. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. What do you make of the notion, which I think it was Peter Heather, who's a historian of the Roman Empire, he wrote a book called Christendom: The Rise and Triumph of a Religion, and he talks about the Saxons coming to Britain and says that, yes, whilst that ended up being a conquering, as it were, is that actually it didn't begin as a conquest. They were actually invited over by Romano-British elites who were feeling exposed after the fall of influence and support from Rome because of the imperial centre collapsing in and out around itself. So is that something you've come across in your research, that the Angles, the Saxons, were invited and then over time they became the de facto rulers, or was it more bloody or more benign than that?
That is one of the narratives presented in a near contemporary early medieval source, that the people were invited over. But those people that were invited over were Hengist and Horsa, who, as I said previously, were actually gods. So obviously, it's an anachronistic. It's not a real narrative. It's an apocryphal narrative of that time, which might have some truth into it. We'll never know for sure. It's perfectly possible that, like, as I said, like, it wasn't just the Anglos on the eastern shore, the Saxon shore, as the Romans called it. It was always a risk of Germanic invasions. But the western shore was also, the Welsh were afraid of Irish invasions. The Irish were the Scoti were like a scare, as much a fearsome invading race as the Saxons were. So sometimes they wanted protection from that. So they might say, oh, maybe we'll get these, or the Picts for that matter. Like, the wall of Hadrian's Wall had been there to protect Britain from the Picts, but then when the Romans are gone, it's like there's a free for all. So it's like the idea of like there was one Celtic world. There wasn't. There was all these different Celtic tribes, and maybe one tribe did think maybe a few Saxon soldiers could be helpful right now. And then once the Saxons arrived, they might decide not to leave. They could take over the whole place. But something like that could have taken a part of the narrative. But I suspect the overall narrative of settlement was much bigger and can't be condensed into such a small thing, because it's significant. They're looking at like the eastern side of England. The initial migration they think it replaced approximately 80% of the population there. So that can't be just a few, that's not a few mercenaries. That's that's families. That's a mass scale migration. And then that 80% replacement in the east was then like blended into the rest of the country as the English moved westwards, so that we don't have the 80% continental ancestry now. It's only about half at most.